Hello, welcome to our continued discussion on subjectivity. So we have been discussing about the various nuances of qualia and epiphenomenal qualia. Today we would see the distinction between qualia and epiphenomenal qualia. These two concepts are closely related in philosophy of mind, but there are key distinctions between them, particularly in how they relate to causality and consciousness. Understanding these distinctions also helps explain Jackson's What Mary Did Not Know thought experiment and the broader philosophical insights that arise from it, especially regarding non-materialistic theories of consciousness. So the question now is, what are qualia? Qualia are the subjective, phenomenal aspects of conscious experience, what it feels like to experience something. For example, the redness of red, the taste of chocolate, or the sound of a bell. Qualia represent the what it is like aspect of experiences, which is fundamentally subjective and first person. Each person's experience of qualia is private and unique. Philosophically, qualia pose a problem for physicalism. They believe that everything, including consciousness, can be explained by physical facts because they seem to represent something that cannot be fully captured by physical descriptions of the brain. So then, what are epiphenomenal qualia? Epiphenomenal qualia refers to the idea that qualia exist as non-physical properties of consciousness, but they are causally inert, meaning they do not affect or influence the physical world. In this view, while we have subjective experiences, qualia, these experiences do not cause any physical actions or changes. Instead, they are byproducts of physical processes in brain. The notion of epiphenomenal qualia is part of a broader position called epiphenomenalism, which suggests that while the brain produces conscious experiences, those experiences do not influence the brain or behavior. So, causal power. Qualia, some theories of qualia hold that qualia are causally active. For instance, the experience of pain or quail may lead you to withdraw your hand from a hot surface. Epiphenomenal qualia. In contrast, epiphenomenal qualia are said to have no causal role. They arise as a consequence of brain activity but do not influence behavior or any physical processes. In this view, the experience of pain might still be felt, but the withdrawal of the hand would be entirely due to neural processes, not the subjective experience itself. So, qualia are often used as an argument against physicalism, suggesting that subjective experience cannot be reduced to physical facts. Epiphenomenal qualia provide a more specific argument against physicalism, indicating that qualia are non-physical but do not challenge the physicalist account of how the brain controls behavior. Qualia are seen as an integral part of what it means to be conscious. In many theories, they are thought to be inseparable from our cognitive and behavioral processes. Epiphenomenal qualia are detached from the functional role of consciousness. They exist but are thought to be irrelevant to how the brain functions in producing thoughts or actions. In reviewing the literature of qualia and epiphenomenal qualia, key distinctions emerge. For example, qualia refers to the subjective, phenomenal aspects of experience like the redness of an apple or the pain of a headache. These are seen as intrinsic, private and ineffable mental properties that characterize consciousness. In contrast, phenomenal qualia or epiphenomenal qualia are understood to have causal effects on physical events. This distinction has sparked debate because epiphenomenalism creates a puzzling scenario. If qualia are causally inert, how do we know about them? Some argue that these challenges the very existence of qualia, as knowing and discussing them seem to imply causal efficacy. So, Jackson's knowledge argument, part of his broader critique of physicalism, suggests that Mary, a scientist who knows all the physical facts about color but has never seen red, would gain new knowledge upon experiencing redness for the first time, implying that some knowledge about qualia escapes the physical description of the world. However, this argument has faced criticism, notably from those who argue that physicalism can still account for Mary's new experience without postulating non-physical properties. Recent evaluations like the 2016 study, The Qualifications or Lack Thereof of Epiphenomenal Qualia, argue that labeling qualia as epiphenomenal undermines the philosophical and scientific study of consciousness by reducing the significance of these experiences. This critique emphasizes that epiphenomenalism may lead to an underappreciation of the role qualia play in human cognition, warning against oversimplifying complex mental phenomena to fit current physicalist paradigms. Thus, the key philosophical insights revolve around whether qualia have a role in influencing physical states or are merely passive, and how this distinction challenges the boundaries of physicalism. The divergence centers on the causal efficacy of qualia, while the convergence lies in the acknowledgement that subjective experiences are real even if their metaphysical status remains contentious. Frank Jackson's What Mary Did Not Know is a key thought experiment in philosophy of mind, primarily aimed at challenging physicalism, the idea that everything, including consciousness, can be fully explained in physical terms. The thought experiment supports property dualism, the view that there are non-physical properties of mind that cannot be captured by physical scenario. So, what do we learn from here? A. We learn that the experiment introduces Mary, a brilliant scientist who knows everything about color vision from a physical and scientific standpoint, but has only ever lived in a black and white room. Upon experiencing the color red for the first time, she gains new knowledge, the subjective experience or qualia of red. Jackson uses this to argue that physicalism is incomplete as it fails to account for these subjective experiences. B. Mary's case suggests that no amount of knowledge about the physical workings of color perception can convey the qualitative subjective experience of actually seeing a color. So, we do see that there have been quite a lot discussed from the Jacksonian view. Now, we will be taking a quick look at the Nagelian view. Thomas Nagel, yet another epiphenomenalist, is very famous for the 1974 paper, What It Is Like to Be a Bat. He addresses a similar concern about the subjective nature of consciousness. Nagel argues that there is something irreducibly subjective about consciousness, what it is like to be a certain organism or to experience the world as that organism. This idea of what it is like emphasizes the difficulty of translating subjective experiences into objective physical terms. While both Jackson and Nagel challenge physicalism, they approach it from different angles. Jackson's approach focuses on the incompleteness of physical information when it comes to subjective experience, qualia. He uses a thought experiment to demonstrate that gaining experience adds knowledge that cannot be derived from physical facts alone. Nagel's approach, the bat thought experiment, highlights the fundamentally subjective nature of experience, arguing that no objective account of an organism's physical structure can fully explain what it is like for that organism to experience the world. This stresses the limits of objectivity in explaining consciousness. Convergence 1. Both Jackson and Nagel emphasize that physicalism is inadequate in explaining subjective experience. They argue that the subjective qualitative aspect of consciousness cannot be reduced to physical terms. 2. Both highlight that knowledge of physical processes, be it color vision or bat echolocation, does not provide access to the inner experience of those processes. Divergence 1. Jackson focuses on the epistemic gap between physical knowledge and qualia. His argument is framed as a challenge to the completeness of physical knowledge, particularly through the lens of the knowledge argument. Divergence. Nagel, on the other hand, focuses on the ontological gap, the idea that some aspects of consciousness are inherently subjective and cannot be fully captured by objective science. Nagel does not frame this as an epistemic issue, but rather as an imitation of objectivity in understanding subjective experience. Jackson's experiment uses a human example, Mary's color vision, to illustrate the epistemic gap, while Nagel uses a non-human example like the bat's experience to explore the limits of objectivity in explaining consciousness. Philosophical implications. Jackson challenges the idea that knowing all the physical facts about a phenomenon can give us knowledge of its subjective qualities. His argument is frequently cited in discussions of property dualism, where mental properties are distinct from but dependent on physical properties. Nagel introduces a more fundamental concern about subjectivity in consciousness, suggesting that science, which aims for objective explanations, may never fully account for the subjective nature of experience. His insights have implications of debates on consciousness and the limits of scientific understanding. In conclusion, while Jackson focuses on the epistemological limitations of physicalism in explaining consciousness via the Mary thought experiment, Nagel highlights the ontological limitations of objectivity in grasping subjective experience through the bat analogy. Both philosophers, however, argue that consciousness involves more than just physical processes, with subjective experience playing a crucial role that resists physicalist explanations. Frank Jackson's What Mary Did Not Know thought experiment is directly connected to the idea of qualia and offers a defense of epiphenomenal qualia. So Mary, the scientist who knows everything that there is to know about the physical facts of color vision but has lived her whole life in a black and white room. The question posed by Jackson is, when Mary leaves the room and sees the color red for the first time, does she learn something new? Jackson argues that she does, which shows that not all knowledge is physical knowledge. The new thing Mary learns is the qualia of red, what it is like to experience the color red. In Jackson's view, qualia are epiphenomenal, which is they are non-physical in nature. Even though Mary knew all the physical facts about color, she didn't know what it was like to experience red. This suggests that qualia are non-physical and cannot be fully captured by physical information alone. Epiphenomenal qualia and the Mary argument, we see that Jackson proposes that these qualia are epiphenomenal. They arise from physical processes in the brain, but they do not affect the physical world. When Mary experiences red for the first time, her experience does not influence her behavior directly, but it does represent a new kind of knowledge that is not physical. Jackson's thought experiment and the idea of epiphenomenal qualia lead to several significant philosophical insights, especially concerning the non-materialistic aspects of consciousness. Jackson's thought experiment is a classic example of the knowledge argument against physicalism. The idea is that no amount of physical knowledge about the brain and perception can fully explain the subjective experience of seeing colors, hearing sounds, feeling emotions. This suggests that physicalism, while it might explain how the brain works, cannot fully account for what it feels like to be conscious. Consciousness involves more than just physical facts. The hard problem of consciousness. Jackson's argument supports the idea of the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers. The hard problem refers to the difficulty of explaining why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experiences, qualia. Epiphenomenal qualia emphasize that even if we know how the brain processes information, the easy problem of consciousness, we still cannot explain why those processes are accompanied by qualitative experiences, the hard problem. So Jackson's argument implies a form of property dualism, while he does not argue for substance dualism, the idea that the mind and body are made of different substances. He suggests the mental properties, qualia, are distinct from physical properties. These challenges the physicalist assumption that everything about the mind can be reduced to brain states. Property dualism allows for the brain to produce qualia, but insists that these qualia are fundamentally non-physical and epiphenomenal. The concept of epiphenomenal qualia emphasizes the non-materialistic aspects of consciousness. It suggests that conscious experience, while dependent on brain activity, cannot be explained solely by the material or physical properties of the brain. This raises deep questions about the nature of subjective experience and whether it can ever be fully understood through the lens of neuroscience or physical science. Daniel Dennett thus further criticizes and seeks for a reconsideration. And other philosophers argue that Jackson's thought experiment relies on intuition that is misleading. They suggest that if Mary truly knew all the physical facts, she would be able to predict what the experience of red would be like. In Dennett's view, there is no need for an appeal to non-physical qualia. Interestingly, Jackson later retracted his argument, agreeing with Dennett that physical knowledge could, in principle, explain everything about consciousness. However, the argument continues to be influential in debates about the nature of consciousness. But the point to be noted is Frank Jackson, a staunch epiphenomenalist, soon converts himself to a physicalist post the various discussions and debates with other staunch physical philosophers like Daniel Dennett. So we see that the distinction between qualia and epiphenomenal qualia highlights the debate over the causal role of subjective experience in consciousness. Jackson's What Mary Did Not Know thought experiment supports the idea that qualia are non-physical and epiphenomenal, presenting a challenge to physicalism. It raises important philosophical questions about the limits of materialism, the hard problem of consciousness, and whether the subjective aspects of experience can ever be fully explained by physical science. So, the Robo-Mary and What Mary Did Not Know are the two thought experiments related to philosophy of mind, particularly around the nature of consciousness and subjective experience. So, we have already discussed about What Mary Did Not Know, and now we will be discussing about the Robo-Mary thought experiment, which was proposed by Daniel Dennett. And why is it important to know? Because pertaining to the discussion of the Robo-Mary of Daniel Dennett, Frank Jackson was convinced, and of course with a discussion with other physicalist philosophers, to be converted from a phenomenalist thinker to a physicalist thinker. So in response to the thought experiments like Mary's, Daniel Dennett introduced Robo-Mary in an attempt to debunk the idea that Mary learns something new when she experiences redness for the first time. Dennett argues that if Mary had truly understood everything about color vision and the brain, she wouldn't be surprised by the experience of redness. She would be able to simulate or predict what it would feel like using her vast knowledge. Robo-Mary thus is a hypothetical robo-version of Mary. If Robo-Mary were programmed with all the physical knowledge of color vision, including detailed knowledge of neural and psychological processes, Robo-Mary would be able to see color without ever having been in a colored environment. This suggests that if someone like Mary knows everything physical, there should be no surprise or new knowledge when she sees red. The debate centers on the nature of qualia between Dennett and Jackson, and Dennett denies the existence of qualia as something mysterious or ineffable. He argues that what we think of as redness can be fully explained through physical processes, and that Mary wouldn't be surprised if she truly had comprehensive knowledge of these processes. Dennett suggests that the concept of redness as a subjective experience is not something additional to the physical facts, but it is a part of the physical description. He argues that our intuitions about Mary learning something new comes from a mistaken way of thinking about the mind. So Dennett's position here is important, for Dennett's critique of the Mary argument is rooted in his materialist and functionalist view of mind. He believes that consciousness and subjective experiences like redness are emergent properties of physical processes, and that if Mary knew everything physical, she would already know what it feels like to see red. He uses Robo-Mary to show that for a machine with complete physical knowledge of color, there would be no gap in understanding. Robo-Mary can process and understand color without needing to experience it directly. So the key features or differences between Robo-Mary and what Mary did not know are as follows. 1. Robo-Mary is a fully mechanistic entity that, according to Dennett, would not experience any new information when exposed to color because all the physical and functional knowledge about color perception is already embedded in her. Mary, the human, in Jackson's original thought experiment, learned something new when she steps out and sees red because the physical knowledge alone, according to Jackson, doesn't give her the qualitative experience of seeing color. For Dennett, the redness of red is not some mysterious, non-physical property, but something that can be fully described by the physical signs of perception. He argues that the experience of seeing red is just the brain processing light of a particular wavelength. And once you understand that processing fully, there is nothing more to be surprised by. Thus, Robo-Mary challenges this by suggesting the complete physical knowledge would include the ability to understand and predict the experience of seeing red without any suggestive gap. The debate between Robo-Mary, Dennett's counterexample, and what Mary did not know, Frank Jackson's knowledge example, represents a rich philosophical discussion about the nature of consciousness, qualia, and the limits of physicalism. So we do notice that the nature of knowledge, basically physicalism versus experiential, talks about the following. 1. The original thought experiment suggests that experiential knowledge is distinct from physical knowledge. Mary, despite knowing all physical facts about color vision, lacks the subjective experience of seeing color. This implies that physicalism is incomplete because it cannot account for the subjective what it is like aspect of consciousness. Dennett's Robo-Mary argues that if Mary had complete physical knowledge, she would already understand the experience of seeing red. According to Dennett, physical knowledge can in principle account for every aspect of consciousness, including the subjective experience. The idea of qualia as something extra is an illusion born out of incomplete understanding. Both the scenarios recognize that there is a distinction between types of knowledge, theoretical versus practical or experiential, but they diverge in their interpretation of the importance of this distinction. Divergence. Jackson's experiment claims that there is a special non-physical kind of knowledge, qualia, that Mary gains when she experiences color, while Dennett argues that complete physical knowledge is sufficient and qualia are not separate or mysterious. The core of Jackson's argument is the existence of qualia, the raw subjective experience of perception. According to Day's view, experiencing redness gives Mary new knowledge, thus proving that subjective experience cannot be reduced to physical information. Dennett rejects the idea of qualia as something irreducible. He argues that if Mary truly had all the physical information, she would not experience anything new when she saw red. He proposes that our intuitions about qualia arise from misunderstandings about how the brain processes information. The redness is simply the way the brain interprets certain wavelength of light and nothing more. Both agree that the experience of red is something that humans can describe and discuss, but they diverge on whether this experience involves non-physical properties. Jackson sees qualia as a fundamental challenge to physicalism, while Dennett sees qualia as explainable within a physicalist framework, considering them as a part of the brain's functional organization. Experience thus plays a central role in consciousness, and it is something that cannot be fully captured by physical descriptions. And what Mary sees read for the first time, she gains a new irreducible kind of knowledge. Even though she already knows everything physically describable about color vision, is counter-argued by Robo-Mary, Dennett's example. We will continue further about Dennett's example of Robo-Mary in our next discussions. Thank you so much.